Some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if it had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction, ice is also great and would suffice. This is a poem by Robert Frost called Fire and Ice, and it's very relevant to our days because it seems to me, at least, that we've almost awakened from a daze, from a civilizational slumber, where most of us in the West thought that the world cannot but continue its ascent through progress into better forms, into more civilized forms. And the past 3 or 4 years has been nothing but the opposite, has been a time of regression. And very recently, the idea of a nuclear war has been very seriously brought back to prominence, which is something that modern generations perhaps never thought they would encounter. Um, why does this happen? Is it inevitable? Or is it a natural cycle of civilizations, as so many ancient people, including the ancient Greeks, believed? So, for everyone on board, this is On Tyranny. We're a radio branch of Ancient Greece Revisited, which is a YouTube show, a mini documentary series on ancient Greece, trying to explore this culture from very different, very novel, very dissident point of views. And On Tyranny is a longer form discussion with great, great people that do us the honor of being here. And today, on the topic of civilizational collapse, ancient and modern, unfortunately, very fortunately, we have Samo Burja, um, who has dedicated a part of his life in investigating exactly this grim and fascinating topic. Samo, welcome to our show, and thank you for being here.
Pleasure to be here with you.
What is your relationship with this fascinating topic of civilizational collapse?
To me, it's always a question of why sort of bother studying civilizational collapse or decline. And the most basic answer is because you hope that we'll do better, right? You hope that history or a better understanding of society might have some practical applications in sort of guiding our future and understanding where we are. For sort of nearly the last 10 years of my life, I've in various capacities done social science work, research work, historical study, and so on in a variety of nonprofit positions and sometimes even a self-guided study. I'm the founder of a company called Bismarck Analysis. It's a political risk consulting firm where, we sort of try to apply some of this analysis to large organizations and sometimes look at markets and the stability of governments. And I'm also a research fellow at the Long Now Foundation, where I study how institutions can endure for centuries or millennia. I've written a few articles your listeners might find interesting on the topic of this sort of macro trends of civilization, including articles on problems of industrial civilization, why, or different article on why we should revise our estimates of how old civilizations are, right, based on the Göbekli Tepe site in Turkey. So for me, this is sort of the overriding, unifying theme, but it's a complex one, right? It has to be approached through a number of directions. And that's why I think that there is no specialty of civilizational collapse. I mean, how could there be, right? How could there be an academic discipline? It is rather almost an addition to a more holistic study of society.
Yeah, and talking about links, I'm going to post all the links below. Whether you're listening to us through Skype, through through Spotify, or through YouTube, I'm going to post the links below. And yeah, what you said touched the chord because part of our work in Ancient Greece Revisited is essentially trying to revive the ancient mind, and show the differences between the ancient and the modern mind. And the modern mind has been very, very much indoctrinated into this narrative of progress that, especially in in the West, as we now call it seems that the whole of the West has been gripped into this powerful idea of progress, which many think it's inevitable, that you cannot but advance. That progress somehow like a natural law ingrained in the universe. But you think differently, is that correct?
Yes, I think that it seems to be a very strong pattern historically that, all societies have sort of a beginning, middle, and end, right? All civilizations so far have failed, have collapsed, or been transformed beyond recognition, not always for the better. Even if something like progress exists, it's not inevitable. It's not a ratchet, right? It's something very temporary, very fragile. It might, in a way, compound over time, right? Like, for example, the population of the world might be higher than it was 300 or 400 years ago. However, it's no guarantee that even something like the population of the world, right, this seemingly very uncorrelated number that's driven by different societies in different parts of the planet, there's no guarantee that 300 or 400 years from now, the world's population is much lower than it is today. There is a lot of airbrushing of history where trends are extended back far beyond what the evidence bears out. You might have seen, say, population graphs where, the world's population is shown to be increasing like on a smooth exponential curve. And while there has been a population explosion in the last 200 years, whenever I look into this graph, I realize they have absolutely no data for a few centuries ago. And whenever you look at the actual data, the population goes up and it sometimes goes down. There are massive population fluctuations, say, in the first few hundred years, the first millennia AD, with, Chinese civilization undergoing the end of the Han Dynasty, the sort of collapse where there's a population reduction of 30%, not to mention the depopulation of the Western Roman Empire and the collapse of the Roman Empire. And if this is true for a number like population growth, you realize it's also true for wealth. And finally, there's a lot of evidence that the history of technology has been simplified, right? It's not just this beautiful industrial revolution that happens in the 18th century or maybe some inventors in the Renaissance. You have very advanced machinery, such as water-powered mills powering, these saws that saw through marble in ancient Rome, or even the use of steam engines in Alexandria during the Hellenistic era, and advanced mathematics and so on. There have in fact been several times when technology itself backslid. And why do I focus so much on population, on economy, on technology? Because the implication of the progressive worldview is that these three things travel together, right? And that they're an unstoppable ratchet that builds on each other. Usually the assumption is that it's driven by technology and that the social changes are just sort of an inevitable side effect, perhaps a desirable one if you're more sort of liberal, perhaps an undesirable one if you're conservative. But, liberals and conservatives sort of actually agree on these very questionable assumptions.
Mm-mm-mm. Yeah. So to take this conversation back to the show's roots, this is, like I said in the beginning, an offshoot of ancient Greece revisited. So let's try and revisit ancient Greece. Um, and Greece in general, in especially the ancient in the sense of the pre-modern. Greece is almost bracketed between two civilizations, and you mentioned these two extremes. A civilization that collapses very fast, and a civilization that takes a very long time to collapse. And um, ironically, Greece is bracketed between these two. The first I have in mind is the so-called Minoan Civilization, and then thousands of years later, the Byzantine civilization. So I think these are two great examples of civilization cycles. To go back to the first, the Minoan civilization, the Minoan civilization was thought to be a legend until very, very recently. In our channel, Ancient Greece Revisited, we have a couple of episodes about this and about the works of Arthur Evans, which remains controversial um, because he was not an archaeologist in the scientific modern sense, but he did uncover an entire civilization in Crete, which he dated in the Greek Bronze Age, so something like 1 or 2,000 years um, before Socrates, let's say, could roam the streets of ancient Athens. These Minoans. These Minoans were ancient by ancient standards. They were ancient for the ancient Greeks, and they were somehow mysterious for the ancient Greeks. They were centered in Crete. Their commercial network was very, very vast. Minoan artifacts are found as far as Spain. Um, and they somehow collapsed, and we don't know a lot about our collapse. But this collapse is timed, or so we think, with a much larger collapse, which you have studied in depth, the so-called collapse of the Bronze Age. Okay, take us through this great event that's shrouded in mystery.
The late Bronze Age collapse is, one of these very interesting events in human history. It's a very interesting time period in that so much of what we know we've only uncovered in the last few decades. From between 1200 BC to about 1150 BC, so over just a 50-year time period, basically in the immediately preceding the Greek Dark Ages, there was a massive collapse of advanced societies in the Eastern Mediterranean. Right before this period, if you had traveled around the Eastern Mediterranean, you would have seen sort of a thriving Mycenaean society, thriving Hittite empire, an advanced Egyptian civilization, the so-called New Kingdom, actually expanding its control all over the Levant. And these societies were interconnected, tightly interconnected through systems of trade, through diplomacy. They would often fight also, of course, devastating wars with each other, though these wars would not result in civilizational collapse, say the rivalry between the Hittite Empire and the Egyptians. The Hittite Empire itself was considered something of a myth until the 19th century, right? We should remember how just in the last 200 years, we've massively revised the ancient history of the Middle East, introducing whole new societies into our understanding, such as the Hittites and the much more ancient Sumerians and so
And
on.
just to give an image, of apologies for the interruption, these were societies, civilizations whose cities would not be seen in terms of numbers until um, the late Roman Empire again. In many ways, like ancient Greece, the city-states that composed ancient Greece were much more modest in a sort of way than sort of some of these urban centers of Egypt or Babylon. Perhaps these Bronze Age civilizations had reached a cultural point that, in terms of sheer size, would not be reached until thousands of years later. Is that correct?
Yeah, there was significant depopulation that happened in the immediate aftermath, with many cities being destroyed. Right. In fact, there's a layer, there's almost an archaeological layer of destruction, right, of charred ruins in all of these sites, all the way from the Peloponnesian down to the Sinai Peninsula. All of these cities in modern day Greece, Turkey, Syria, Egypt, often just burned, destroyed, abandoned. There's some parts of this eastern Mediterranean coastline where, they ceased to find pottery in the aftermath of collapse. Now, pottery for archaeologists, after it's invented, it's such a reliable indicator of human activity that when it's not found, the assumption is there's just no one living there. So, either some parts regressed so much that, they stopped using even pottery, which I doubt, or they were so devastatingly depopulated that there just weren't any people there. So, you can imagine 100 years after the Bronze Age collapse, hiking through the high, dry hills of Anatolia and finding between overgrown shrubs the long lost and overturned stones of a massive city like Hattusa still visible.
What an image.
And these societies, right? I mentioned that they were interconnected by trade. This was not just sort of a means of enrichment. It was sort of connected by the basic infrastructure of their civilization. Bronze is an alloy. It's an alloy of tin and copper. For a variety of geological reasons, tin and copper tend to not be found in the same deposits, in the same mountain ranges. This means these societies, which made heavy use of bronze, had to trade with each other and would often import tin or copper from great distances. Tin especially proved to be pretty rare, and there is still live debate where exactly these Eastern Mediterranean civilizations imported their tin from. There are two options that are commonly discussed, both very exotic. One is that they were importing tin all the way from modern-day Afghanistan, right? If you imagine through, the relatively harsh mountains of Persia, or perhaps through the Indian Ocean, sailing down the Indus River through what is today called the Persian Gulf. The other option is actually an option that we know for a fact later civilizations made use of. We know the Phoenicians, many, many centuries later, sailed to Britain and imported tin from Britain. In fact, some place names in modern England seem to have Phoenician origins. So it is intriguing and quite plausible that these Bronze Age civilizations might have been importing tin from as far away as Britain or Afghanistan, and there have been metallurgical analyses to try to establish where the metal came from. So this really was the backbone of these societies, right? If the trade breaks down, the tin and copper shipments stop, bronze becomes very rare, very expensive, and every new tool or weapon you want to make, you have to melt down something else.
On a quick note, one of the names of the British Isles was Kassiteridis Nisi in Greek. Kassiteros is an alloy, and these islands, the British islands, were named after this alloy. So there might be a connection there, in fact.
Yes. And, this Eastern Mediterranean world was also, again, it is a world of naval travel. It was a world even of naval empires. You mentioned the Minoans earlier. The Minoans excelled as a naval civilization, setting up on numerous islands and being an intermediary of trade. You had interesting imports and exports that, on this basic backbone of the metal trade, all sorts of useful materials were shipped. For example, cedar trees were imported in great number into Egypt, right, as a source of high quality wood.
And I presume the same goes for ideas, and the same goes for religious rituals, and ideas in general. That would be correct, I guess.
Indeed. There is a site called Amarna where people, there's actually a really good, very readable translation that your listeners might enjoy reading. It's called the Amarna Letters. And these are the copies of the diplomatic correspondences of, the ancient kings of Egypt. It's remarkable, and we're very fortunate to have found these. And in these letters, it makes clear that a very common mode of diplomacy was sort of diplomatic marriage. And one of the standards for whether a diplomatic marriage was considered sound was the treatment of the person. So in many ways, it's not just a spouse, it's not just a union. The Pharaoh's daughter or son is in a way a hostage. If relations sour, their physical safety might not be guaranteed. And one of the standards of whether they're well treated, and this is actually inquired upon often in the letters, is are they allowed to worship their gods? These were all polytheistic societies. So the assumption was that if a Hittite princess sets up life at the Egyptian court, that a small shrine or temple to her gods, or his gods if it's a prince, are made available. So at the very elite level, these sort of religious rites would spread. They would be multilingual. They would have correspondences where the letters would be carried, sometimes 1,000 kilometers to their intended destination. So the cultural exchange was very deep. And honestly, even, things like material cultures would intermix, right? Wine might be imported from wine-growing regions to regions that do not grow wine. Cannot grow grapes for wine.
Yeah, that is fascinating. And what's even more fascinating is this vast interconnected world that you just spoke of collapsed within a very, very brief history moment in time. And I didn't know that such evidence of actual destruction and rapid abandonment were found. This almost conjures up an image in our minds, some kind of end of world apocalyptic image where all these great urban something happened and these people just had to run for their lives with whatever they had. And this happened not just in one place, but in a pretty large geographical area spanning from the Peloponnese in Greece to the Middle East in the east and to the south to Egypt, and all this happening. Well, you mentioned 100 years. I think 100 years is a blink of an eye when it comes to these events, right? So
50 years, even 50 years. Imagine this: two generations. You might be born in a thriving city, and in your old age, you're grazing goats next to the ruins of
wow.
that city.
So yeah, just to conjure a modern image, we live in such a time of complacency and conformity, and here in on tyranny, we're trying to break this as much as possible. But all around me, I find people that are very, yeah, very complacent. I think is the word. Very reassured that this civilization they see all around them is just going to last for forever, almost. So to conjure up this image is almost like being born in New York, in current New York, with all the technology, all the comforts, and then something happens, and then, like you said, when you're an old man, you're still in New York, by the way, or perhaps you're just outside, and you're overlooking what used to be New York, and it's um, this leveled down
Yeah.
field where scavenging, roaming bands are looking in the scraps to find metal to melt and create like primitive tools to herd their goats. Like a Mad Max scenario almost, right?
This would be the closest to, kind of Mad Max world that I think we've seen, especially in Mesopotamia, right, where these advanced civilizations had persisted for so long, the Sumerians, the Babylonians, and so on. Sort of only the Assyrians sustain proper urbanized life and proper agriculture in this period. Large chunks of the formerly irrigated lands, right, where these very advanced, waterworks, irrigation systems, supported intense agriculture. A lot of these are just replaced by pastoralists with their flocks of grazing animals. And you have these interesting cases where these very, petty warlords sort of declare themselves the king and ruler of Babylon. And, it's like, it's 4,000 people. But they take on this great title of
Yeah,
even unrelated peoples, right? Because there was a massive migration of peoples in these
yeah. I guess
destroyed
like
cities.
the image of Rome outlived historical Rome, and the idea of a Holy Roman Empire emerged times and again in the Middle Ages. Although, as some commentators have said, it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. I guess it's something similar with these warlords. They have a memory of this great civilization, but they don't understand how far they have fallen, essentially, right?
Or they do understand, but the boast still works,
Mm-hmm.
right? You hear the master of Babylon has summoned you to give tribute. You might want to do that, even if the even if Babylon is no more, right? It's whoever's claimed that title. It means that they're the strongest person
Yeah,
on the hill. It means no one stronger is around, even if it's just a
and
guy
you're
and
like,
his
yeah,
200
to
warriors.
attend, to attend with some mangy horses around. Um, so we have to give our audience what they're looking for, like what happened.
Yeah, the simplest answer is that we don't exactly know what happened. We do know that there was a massive invasion of the so-called Sea Peoples. This is recorded by the ancient Egyptians. You can tell the ancient Egyptians are having a hard time because in the temples and sites that describe the battles, the Egyptians always speak of a crushing
Mm.
victory over the Sea Peoples. And then 2 years later, there's another crushing victory. Except this one is deeper in Egypt. So the Egyptians just keep winning,
But they're
and they,
retreating.
they keep they're embellishing the story,
Yeah.
right? When you're reporting on the pharaoh, you don't say that it was a grueling battle where maybe it was even a
Mm.
pyrrhic victory, if it even was a victory. You report it as this like great
Mm.
win that's going to secure Egypt forever, and these very intense battles are happening all
Mm.
over Egypt. So we know that something like a barbarian invasion
Mm.
happened, but we also know that there was a series of natural disasters that might have made this ancient world vulnerable to such invasions, right? Volcanic eruptions, many earthquakes, right? There's evidence of earthquake damage on some of the cities. And then finally, there are also those who hypothesize disease having weakened these cities. And then lastly, there's a proposal that there was an economic crisis of the social system that basically kind of
Mm.
bankrupted these states de facto. The late Bronze Age society was very interesting in that many cities, especially those of the Mycenaeans, were organized on the so called palace
Mhm.
economy system. We could talk about that a little bit. In the palace economy system, basically, it seems like people would bring tribute to these massive, massive palace complexes, right? Bring the raw materials to the palace. These would be inspected, and then this material would be handed out to craftsmen who would produce finished products, and these finished products would then be exported. In a strange way, and of course this metaphor doesn't work perfectly. The ancient kings of the Mycenaean world were less engaged in the job of taxation and almost just directly administering their
Almost like a
economies.
communistic society, it seems, was this late
Right.
Bronze Age.
Or perhaps almost a feudal one, right? The two can merge into each other in a weird way. You can have this kind of central planning with enforced quotas, and
Hmm.
it's very interesting how this might have worked. We found these vast complexes, and we know these aren't just treasuries because often these vast rooms would store material that is perishable material, right? Stuff that goes bad, that it makes no sense to keep in a vault for 10
So
years.
it was,
So it's a
yeah, it's
warehouse.
warehouse, like a redistribution. And I've heard and read and understood that this also provided for this dual role of the king. You know, the king, the great man of this
Hmm.
Bronze Age civilizations, was a political leader, and he was also a religious leader. He was like a king magician, archetypically, so to speak, whereby this redistribution of the wealth was seen symbolically as somehow something like a fertility rite, where this man would embody some kind of fertility god, that gives the plenty of life back to the people, right?
Yes, it's interesting to note how profound this experience is, because in a very different society, many thousands of years later, the English word Lord comes out of the keeper of the bread, the giver of the bread.
Mm.
So, in a very real way, you receive bread from someone, well, they're your Lord then, right? And I think this is something very, very basic, that this mystery, the mystery of life, but also the means of your material sustenance, right? These two things can be very tightly connected in the.
And you know, from the explanations that you gave, I used to think the first was the most fascinating, the invasion hypothesis. And on this show, we talked a lot about the Indo-European hypothesis. I had two people who are, in their own way, experts in Indo-European cultures. And we know that this idea that around this time, around the 12th century, there was a massive wave of northern warlike people who descended and kind of raided over this Bronze Age world. And these were the so-called Indo-Europeans, or Aryans, as they were then called. Obviously, the word has fallen in disrepute after the Second World War. And the theory that these people, this Indo-European invasion, from what these experts have conveyed to me, it has fallen in disrepute, not necessarily for scientific reasons, but more for reasons of political correctness, for a lack of a better word. But before going to this tangent, from what you're saying, for some reason, now it's that fourth hypothesis that sounded more interesting, this economic collapse. Because sometimes I'm thinking, I'm no economist, but sometimes I'm thinking, like, how can there be an economic collapse? In other words, sure, I understand all the mechanisms. You print more money, inflation goes up, uh, gold prices go up, and yes, the Fed is to blame. We know all these things, but I'm thinking, when push comes to shove, when an economy, a society is really threatened with destruction, you just go out and cultivate the land and eat from the land and create your own economy. Like, how can an econ I don't know if I'm thinking about this right, but the idea of a total economic collapse, not like a recession style, even like a great recession like we had in the beginning of the last century in the United States, that I can understand. But a total collapse based on economy still sounds weird. Is there something I'm missing here?
I think that the multi-causal view of this can help clarify, where if you consider that agricultural productivity in a place like Egypt or Mesopotamia rested directly on the maintenance of vast irrigation systems and the managing of water for an entire society, right? This is like sort of, whoever controlled the Nile River controls Egyptian society. If you do not have an organization that does this kind of water management, that can command the labor of many thousands of people to dig these canals or maintain these systems, agricultural production goes down. Where will you go to,
Mm,
farm
mm.
if everything outside of the river area is a desert? Or if it's a relatively dry, harsh grassland where, again, a grazing animal might succeed, well, then you have to switch from being a farmer to keeping these animals. And how are you protecting your flock, and who's protecting you?
So the shape,
Why doesn't just someone come and
so
steal
the
your
shape
flock
of
and
the
so
society
on?
changes.
Exactly. And there's internal predation in the society, right? Even in a modern world, if you imagine like retreating to the countryside, but the countryside is beset by murdering gangs of people, you might not be easily able to defend yourself, right? In modern civil wars, it often happens that, food is
Mm.
confiscated, let alone if something like a failing central government still exists. Soldiers might come and to feed themselves or at the orders of the, pharaoh who's in hard times, they take all your grain. Farming takes time,
Yeah.
right?
So we're
So
talking,
you could see a massive reduction in population in a short
so
period
we're
of
talking
time
about an
from famine.
economic. Yeah, perhaps I confused the economic with the financial here, to be honest. So we're not talking about a
Exactly.
financial.
A very modern confusion,
Yeah, yeah,
perhaps.
yeah. One that I think you clarified. Um, could there be something deeper controlling all these causes? Could cultures have almost like a life of their own? Um, and all their aspects, the economic, the political, the military, being just fronts, different sides of something much deeper. Um, could there be something like a, a soul of each culture, and that soul kind of decaying?
I think that the question, with humans, it's an ancient philosophical question. If we have a soul, what might the soul be, Um, and with societies, this is even trickier. It's sort of like when we talk of the culture, is that just a word we use for sort of the embodied reality of the whole society and how its different pieces fit together? Or is there something that's really there that only has these material expressions, right? It's not the material
That is
itself,
what I
but
was
it's these
thinking about.
expressions.
Yes.
Yeah. I think that there's the possibility of both, right? In my writing, I write about social technologies, which I contrast with material technologies, where I note that sometimes there are these, purely human interactions that have a difficult to capture essence, but come to define society, right? Like custom, religion, codes of law, and so on, right? I One of the more fascinating books I've read is have you ever heard of the bicameral mind hypothesis? The bicameral, there's a book titled The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. It's a book by Julian Jaynes.
So I confused it with another book that's also called The Origins of Consciousness,
Ah,
by Erich Neumann. And this has also fascinating connections to our discussions, which I'm sure we're not going to have the time to touch, at least this time
well,
round. But
Julian
yeah,
Julian Jaynes, his hypothesis, I'm not persuaded by it, but I find it very intriguing. What he proposes is that there was a psychological, and spiritual crisis that actually broke the civilizations of the Bronze
mm,
Age. He proposes that Bronze Age peoples had a very different awareness of themselves, that when they would hear, they would actually have these auditory hallucinations where they would hear the voices of the gods and sort of the will of the gods, and they would perceive these as external forces, right? They wouldn't internalize them the way we would today, where we have these sort of, you say, I'm angry, rather than, I'm possessed by, Ares has inspired me or something, I am under the influence of Ares.
so he believed that this was a physiological change that happened.
Yes, yes, like a very basic psychological, very basic change in the way the brain is set up, that the brain can be set up in many ways. And that what happened was suddenly the gods go silent, and people have this new, different consciousness of self awareness, and all of the social structures break down. Because before this, you obeyed the king because the king was the voice of the gods, and now the gods are silent. You no longer hear the gods, and the king is suddenly just this person. I'm not fully convinced by it, but he makes this case again by the change in literature, where basically he even makes an argument about the Iliad. There's a chapter of the book titled "The Mind of the Iliad," and he says, that there's in general no consciousness, no self-awareness in the
Mm.
Iliad. Basically, that there are a few exceptions, but the words used, such as psyche, in most instances mean like life substance, right? Like there's a dying warrior and he bleeds out his psyche onto the ground or breathes it out. And then there's thumos, and this later means emotional soul, but here it just means kind of motion. This kind of analysis, however, is hard to distinguish from just a change, a change in literary style, right? Where you might have easily a literary style that describes the physical
Mm.
and does not talk about these kind of motivations and inner emotional life except through the metaphor of gods. But his radical proposal would be that to these people, no, these were not metaphors. That's how they experienced their emotional life, and that this was a very different way of being than what happened in the aftermath. And I realize that your listeners might not realize the Iliad is basically set in this time period of the Bronze Age collapse. It's like from the stories are from about this period.
Fascinating topic. I mean, just before without going too deep into this book, obviously, I'd be very curious. Like, what kind of evidence can you have to claim such a thing? Like, what kind of evidence does he produce?
Well, what he produces is he basically goes through this sort of analysis of just the literature of the era, with lots and lots of people, in fact, writing that the gods have gone silent. And it's a conjecture, but it's a very thorough conjecture that goes through many, many sources of literature. And like I said, like from the era, right? So this is things that are written at that time. He makes this argument that such a large and profound change in the way people write, going through multiple societies simultaneously, when they start speaking of the interlife as just personal emotional
Mm,
phenomena, that this must reflect a change of
mm,
consciousness, that it's sort of we don't have evidence that what the people say was happening in their hearts and
mm,
minds was not
mm, mm,
happening. But I find it a very provocative tour of many different cultures, even if one ultimately does not
yeah.
agree or is not persuaded by the hypothesis. And I note he does not prove the hypothesis, but I brought it up since it's an
Mm.
example of the kind of approach where something that's very intangible, that has no material footprint, might easily be the origin of the breakdown of a civilization.
Yeah, no, absolutely fascinating. Me, I'm someone who does believe that the mind has a life of its own and has a history of its own, and I do believe that ancient people thought differently, experienced the world differently. Whether that can be flattened down to changes in the structure of our brains, I personally doubt it. It sounds pretty implausible, but who am I to say? But I don't think it's necessary. I think that we open our eyes every morning and we just see a world that is very, very different from the world the ancient Greeks saw. Not necessarily because of the technology that surrounds us, just looking at the sky.
Hmm. Hmm.
And it's not all metaphor. It's not that the ancient Greeks, they saw the spirit of Zeus in the sky. I think it's far more subtle than that. I think just the sky was incorporated into their consciousness in a very, very different way. I think that our minds are very much shaped by modern science. We almost live in this matrix kind of reality, like Neo looked around at the end and he saw the zeros and ones receding into infinity, because he saw that the world is a computer program, computer simulation. I think we do live in such a world where, the mind of someone like Descartes has imprinted itself on us so much that we almost measure and calculate without realizing. We look at the sky, we think there is a given objective distance between us and the limits of the
Right.
atmosphere, and we can picture the Earth, this little speck moving around this larger complex. And these images of modern science, I think they're there in
And
our
they
mind.
sort of shape our
Yeah,
consciousness, yeah, through
yeah,
that, yeah.
yeah, yeah, and it's a topic we can talk it in another time that I find very fascinating. But going to the Iliad, it's yeah, just to put some context for the listener.
The city of Troy is one of the cities that has a layer of destruction from this
Yes,
period.
yes. So in fact, the War of Troy could be referring to something like some event that happened during this collapse. But it's very interesting that what you referred before, that Homer had these words like psyche, psyche, thymos, variably translated as spirit or anger. Or he did not have a word of a unitary consciousness, like we have. We say consciousness, and I wake up every morning and I feel like I'm inside a body, right, and oh,
But perhaps importantly, this unitary consciousness also is in a way disconnected from your environment that is not fully
yeah,
truthful.
yeah, yeah.
So it's not just the case that our perspective is like, say, objectively more informed. It is also neglecting parts of reality.
Yeah, it's just different. It's not necessarily more advanced. It's just different. In Homer's works, also very interestingly, there is no writing. There's no reading. There is no writing. Essentially, Odysseus and Achilles, they're all illiterate by modern standards. There is one verse, by the way, in the Iliad, very inconclusive, that might imply something like writing, but there's no writing in the rest. And there's reasons to assume that the Iliad itself was conceived orally, like it was written, memorized. It was never written down by Homer, if such a man existed. It was never written down like Shakespeare wrote his works. It was worked in memory, which is pretty fascinating. Um, and this world that Homer describes is pretty much the world of the Greek Dark Ages. It's the world that immediately followed this Bronze Age collapse. Is that correct?
Yes, and it's also a world where the Mycenaeans are recorded as having, in some cases, joined the Sea Peoples and the invaders, right? At least by the Egyptians and so on. So some fraction of the warriors of these societies actually joined the invaders or allied with them. So it would not be at all a stretch of the imagination if the Mycenaean Greeks, in fact, had sailed and in these desperate times made war on the city of Troy.
Mm-mm.
So we might have been greatly underestimating the truthfulness of the Iliad,
Yeah. Then again, it is a poetic form, and it's fascinating
of
how it's
course.
very new, like talking about consciousness, right? If you look at the what the Minoans left behind, and they left some writing behind, the linear scripture, um, and to the degree that we can uncipher it, it's nothing but catalogs of, well, you talked about warehouses and grains and how the king would amass all all of these goods and redistribute them. And what we found in writing kind of confirms that. They were all big catalogs of who owes what to whom. And then fast forward, you said 50 years, or maybe 100 years until this new culture culminated. And you have this powerful poetic form, which is the epic. Nothing
Yes.
to do with these boring catalogs of grain. So somehow these illiterate warrior nomads that came in, that who perhaps caused the collapse or didn't cause the collapse. They brought this poetic form that is very new, and that reflects a new kind of consciousness and a new kind of understanding as an individual who fights against other individuals for glory, until his name is remembered forever, right?
I think that the the sort of this approach to immortality, right? This everlasting
Mm.
honor was a big driver of later Greek and classical society. And in fact, it might have been refactoring the very basis on which societies were built. Because this sort of heroic individual that's venerated for centuries, maybe even mythologized, this is a very foundational thing for Greek city states and for the aspirations of the Greeks. Later on, also, the Romans have a version of this as well, this sort of heroic mythos. It should be noted that Alexander the Great is imitating Hercules, right? In a very self aware way, he is trying to sort of recreate these great deeds of Hercules. Well, who are Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great imitating,
Alexander.
right? They're imitating Alexander. And then maybe even 2,000 years later, who is Napoleon imitating? Well, he's
Caesar.
imitating Julius Caesar and
Mhm.
Alexander. So, in a way, like a small strand of this hero worship, right, persists to our own era
Mhm.
and motivates, great action and great achievement.
And this is linked, just to link it back to the by what was the name, the bicameral mind, and this idea of
Hypothesis, yeah.
hypothesis. Yes, this idea of fame and of your name surviving you, is also coupled with a very radical notion about mortality that we find in Homer, because for the first time we find a notion about death that's in a way very modern. Homer presents death as pretty final, with no afterlife that at least we can hope for. He does give us a glimpse of an afterlife, but it's nothing that you can hope for. In the 12th chapter of the Odyssey, you have Odysseus, he descends, or rather reaches the underworld, or the world of the dead, and there he does not exactly like what he sees, and it's pretty final. While the Bronze Age civilizations that collapsed appear to have had this reincarnational, cyclical idea of life, right? That could this be connected to a change of consciousness? Could that be connected to a change of our brain? Can we draw a hypothesis there, you think?
I I think that it's just very difficult. It's just very difficult to reach definitive conclusions on this because there's so much about the human being, humanity that we don't understand. Right? Any hypothesis, when it touches on these things beyond material causes, any hypothesis on the state, destiny, or trajectory, or even past of a society, must necessarily make claims, anthropological claims, about human nature. And it can either make these claims explicitly or it can assume them. And, this honestly is one of the reasons that I feel the anthropology, the claims implicitly made about human nature by our, political and economic institutions, I just feel that there's no possible way they can hold. I sort of feel like the Homo economicus or even the rationally self interested voter or all of these things, they just don't ring true.
Mm.
And that's sort of one of the big reasons why, I expect that once we get a better understanding of humans, our society, our civilization might have to change quite a bit.
Yeah, well, this brings us to today, and it's a very bleak thought, but like I said in the beginning, my generation was raised in a world that was heading towards the best of possible worlds, and now it just doesn't seem like that. And we had a series of, I'd say, pretty boring kind of crisis: the global economic crisis of 2008, um, COVID, and now not to underestimate it at all. But it always feels like looking at it in a distance, the Ukraine war, and there's so much propaganda from both sides. But unfortunately, there's a lot of propaganda from the Western side as well. It almost reminds me what you said about the Egyptians. That they had these crushing victories, but they kept retreating, and Ukrainians unfortunately are presented as having this, well, not crushing, but these significant kind of victories here and there, but they're also retreating. And the West has been taken aback, not almost numb, not knowing how to deal with this pretty conventional threat. Putin is not doing anything that military leaders have not been doing for thousands of years. It's very, very conventional, for very conventional reasons, by the way, very standard reasons, very standard tactics.
It's almost an intrusion of history into our world that has believed to have done away with
Yes.
history.
Where does our culture stand in relation to these events and in relation to possible collapses?
I think that to a very significant extent, the Western world has to understand that the international system that it believed was building as the universal home of all mankind is actually just the system of the Western world. In a very real way, if you look at the list of sanctions against Russia, who is it? It's the United States, it's Western Europe, it's allies like Japan and South Korea, and that's almost the end of the list. Even countries like India, that are sort of touted as democracies and so on, are very ambivalent on Russia, right? So there's a way in which the Western world has shrunk back to the West. It's no longer the case that countries feel the need to take sides in a fight between, say, Russia and the rest of Europe, or Russia and the United States. And it's a very big change. The U.S. remains immensely militarily powerful. So I don't think any purely military defeat would ever catastrophically change Western thinking. Even right now, arguably the United States is militarily more powerful than it was a year ago, since its NATO allies are now more closely coupled with American interests than they were before, which, by the way, I will note, American and European interests do differ in the details. Just consider energy policy. But I feel like internal crises to the Western world, this view that, maybe China just does outgrow us economically, that could be a real crisis of faith in our system.
Where do you see our culture in this cycle of civilizations? What time is the clock of civilizations at right now?
I think it's sort of the embattled empire of universal consciousness. Now, let me unpack this. I'm perhaps slightly building off of this almost Spenglerian view, where we reached the stage of universal empire sometime in the 1990s. What is universal empire? The belief that this civilization that you have and this sort of state is without bounds and without limits and encompasses all of mankind. This is a fairly late stage of aspiration, of grandeur, really. It's megalomaniacal, honestly, where, you're like, oh, I'm not the Roman emperor, I'm the commander of all mankind. And even very wise people like Marcus Aurelius, arguably in Marcus Aurelius's mind, he is setting the world right. That's why he's governing the Roman Empire, right? So this sort of late development of grandeur bleeds over into universality. However, the universal aspiration cannot be justified by the facts on the ground, and external defeats come more and more crashing in and forcing a kind of doublethink, a kind of view where, oh, we're the universal empire, and simultaneously, oh, we're threatened and embattled and might be defeated in any moment. It's a very strange type of consciousness. If if I had to give a historical analogy, I think the current Western world is similar to the Byzantine Empire. They still view themselves as the universal empire, but so much of their effort is, spent on pacifying barbarians, on manipulating barbarians to fight each other. And, while Constantinople might be a great city, Rome has already fallen into ruins. So I think we're at the beginning of this process, and I think that until this pretense of the universal empire is surpassed by a different civilizational context. And our formulation of the universal empire is the international rules based order or
The
whatever, right?
global
Like
states,
we
yes.
exactly. We pretend like something like the UN is just neutral and represents all of
Yes.
mankind, rather than a very peculiar
Political
vision
power.
of how humans
Yeah.
should be. Exactly. And I will note it's based in New York. It was set up by the victorious powers of World War
Yes.
II. Switzerland was not a UN member until 2002.
Mm.
They thought it was not compatible with their neutrality. Think about that for a second.
Whoever doubts what you just said, I would invite him to actually read the Declaration of the United Nations, which is a pretty interesting and in some ways strange document. It was written by one Julian Huxley, brother of Aldous Huxley, writer of Brave New World. Which I always find very ironic. You have this great writer of this futuristic utopia slash dystopia, science fiction utopia slash dystopia, however you read it, Brave New World. And his brother is actually a politician, kind of building a Brave New World in actuality. And the United Nations are a part of it. And in that declaration, you will find some very strange chapters, such that the idea that communism or dialectical materialism, I think it was mentioned in this document, was essentially the correct doctrine for a global state, but human nature was somehow faulty, but it can eventually be corrected through some kind of genetic engineering. So there are these ideas at the seed of the United Nations, strangely enough, written between the lines.
Well, it's and these were always, these ideas were always backed up by American military power, but also, European, American, and eventually Japanese economic might. And while the United States remains militarily strong, the U.S. was so supremely dominant economically in 1945, that world is past, right? So you still have this strange document that has some very beautiful language at times, but ultimately is sort of a declaration of a global authority,
Mm.
a global authority that almost immediately sort of crashed, right? Because the Soviet Union and the U.S. did not end up coordinating as closely as they were hoping. And note, actually, 1945-46, the hope was that the Soviet Union would closely work with the West, right? That's just think about that. That has a little bit of a dystopian vibe to it as well, right? What was this world that they were going to build? It was, there's the compromise between FDR and Stalin. Where does that compromise lie? The Anyway, that world broke apart, and then in 1991, one of the great empires of the world that itself had its own universal
Mm.
aspirations, right? Again, Marxist-Leninism was a universalist, imperial, aspirational view. When I say imperial, I mean like, this thing that wants to gather all the peoples of the world and bring them into a single political
Yeah, and wants
unit.
to apply kind
Yeah.
of a blanket culture across vast
Yeah.
areas of land and ethnic
A
units. Yes.
unification. Yeah. Yeah, and this empire collapsed, and one perspective I have is that maybe the Soviet Union just fell first.
Mm.
There's a collapse gap, and I think maybe sort of the end of this system. I don't think, unless there's a nuclear war, I don't think it'll be anything as extreme as the Bronze Age
Mm.
collapse. But the West might experience an end of empire and ideology not too dissimilar from the collapse of the Soviet Union, right?
Yeah, how real is that threat of nuclear war right now? And we're talking 28th of April, 2022, to be precise.
Well, 2 or 3 weeks ago, I think the risk was higher than it was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Right now, a variety of things cause me to be a bit more optimistic. So I think it's a little bit better. But we shouldn't be, just because it's unlikely in any given year, doesn't mean that this is an acceptable risk, right?
Mm.
What does it mean if for 30 years the chance of nuclear war is at 1% a year or 0.5% a year, right? These
They add
these
up.
numbers, well, they add up very quickly. And I think we have entered a period where, just as a background risk, the risk of a nuclear exchange between Russia and the United States is higher for a longer period than it has been. People forget that even during the Cold War, there were many periods of rapprochement between Russia and the United States where they viciously competed, but they trusted each other to be able to come to treaties to undertake things like arms
Mm.
limitation. Right now, we are in a situation where Vladimir Putin calls the West agreement incapable, right? Incapable of setting an agreement. And it's not even clear he's wrong. And obviously, in the West, we have very little reason to trust Putin's word if he gives it. So, without this very basis of trust between the elites of our two systems, how can you navigate something as delicate as nuclear risk? So, think of it not as impending doom, but just this big background
An
risk.
endemic
Yeah,
problem of the current state.
exactly, exactly.
Yeah, and not to open too many fronts, understanding the time limitations, but very recently there was a very, very powerful statement from the Chinese government directed against the United States. I think it was Putin who called the United States an empire of lies. And China said something similar. It didn't use these exact terms, but it was, people can look it up. The Chinese, essentially the representative of the foreign ministry, from what I understand, in China, he said, yeah, he spoke almost like a true, communist. He said the United States is a threat to world civilization, and they're the murderers of peoples. And regardless, we're not going to even comment on the truth of that or not, but being spoken by China is just ringing many alarms, isn't it?
Yes, yes. And ultimately, that, perhaps we, to end on a more hopeful
Mm.
note, there are many cases not just of societies entering decline and failure and collapse, but societies having a rebirth, a restructuring, right? So I think that one of the hopes we should keep for the 21st century is that these crises cause us to rethink what must be rethought, reapproach what must be reapproached, and then with new strengths go back, to building a civilization and society worth remembering and worth living
Wow,
in.
that's a great place to end. Samo, where can we find you?
You can find my writing on the website samoburja.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at Samo Burja. For those interested more in the sort of political and geopolitical thinking, you can also find the Bismarck Brief at briefbismarckanalysis.com and subscribe to a weekly newsletter with an in-depth analysis every Wednesday on one of the great countries or economies of the world.
Thank you very, very much for being here, Samo. I hope this is the first of a few of these discussions. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for having me on the show. It was a great conversation, and I look forward to future
This
ones.
was On Tyranny. And as always, stay safe, but most importantly, stay free.